I remember waking before my alarm, like my body knew the day would not be ordinary. The April sunlight came in thin and warm through the blinds, and for a moment the kitchen smelled like coffee and lilies, the church coffee pots I suppose in my mind already. I smoothed the navy dress I'd bought for the occasion, felt the linen cool under my fingers, and wound my gray hair up into the low bun I have worn for as long as anyone can remember. The little gold cross Howard gave me at our 40th anniversary lay heavy at my collarbone. I touched it twice, a private prayer, and then I was out the door. The parking lot felt the same as always. I parked under the old oak, the same corner where I'd left my car for decades. The bark had that dry, familiar scent, earthy and sharp, and when I closed the door I could hear the hollow thunk of the church organ from inside the building. My palms were a little slick. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, then let them go. Just one Sunday I told myself, just come in, sit, listen. I avoided the front entrance. The back door was easier for me. Smaller crowds, familiar echoes. The hallway smelled of old hymnals and lemon polish. The organ played "Great is Thy Faithfulness," and the irony of that hymn made my throat tighten. People were moving like tide lines. Families, couples, the same faces I had known for years. At first there were only a few curious glances. Then quietly a ripple. Betty Monroe's eyes found me and her hand flew to her husband's sleeve. Robert's eyebrows arched. The Petersons turned their heads in a small synchronized motion I'd seen in 20 years of potlucks. And there he was, Deacon James, standing near the sanctuary doors, his button shining on his lapel, shoes polished like mirrors. He was greeting people, one by one, with that practiced warmth that never quite reached his eyes. Our eyes met. I smiled. I felt my breath go shallower, as if someone had put a hand on my chest. I walked toward him. "Good morning, Deacon James," I said, and lifted my hand. It felt natural, like the handshake that had punctuated every Sunday of my life. He looked at my hand as if it were something that might burn him. His mouth tightened. For a moment I thought he would take it. Then he turned, deliberate, slow, and reached past me to shake the hand of the woman behind me. There was a silence that dropped like a heavy curtain. The organ softened, the hymn lost its shape. I could hear the whisper start. First a hiss, then a string of soft syllables that moved from pew to pew. "She came back. After what she did." Voices braided together, low and patient as winter. My fingers hovered in the air, alive with the small heat of motion that had been stopped. I felt the empty space of the handshake like a chill. My bag dug into my side. My thumb kept finding the seam of the leather as if for reassurance. My legs trembled. The room felt suddenly small and loud. The scratch of shoes, a cough, someone clearing a throat very close to my ear. Faces turned away or leaned forward, the way a congregation does when it anticipates a sermon. "Mrs. Moretti, I don't think you should be here," Deacon James said, low enough that he wasn't shouting but loud enough for heads to swivel. "Not after what you did to the pastor." The words hit me like a sudden wind. I tried to place them, replay them in my head. What did I do? Asked about the roof fund that Howard and I had helped raise for 2 years. Asked why the mission for women had been quietly shelved while the pastor drove a new car. Those were questions, not explosives. Yet the accusation hung there like a stain. Someone behind me muttered, "She ruined his reputation." Another voice always had a sharp tongue. I felt them as if they were hands pinching. My breathing got shallower. I folded my shoulders inward, like a bird trying to make itself small. Then Margaret Wilson's hand settled on my elbow. It was warm and small and steady. Margaret, who speaks in whispers, who carries her glasses on a cord and smells faintly of lavender, stood beside me and didn't look away from the other people. "Come sit with me, Eleanor," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was a firmness that surprised me. As we walked down the aisle, the pews seemed to part. Some stairs followed. Some stopped halfway, as if unsure whether to commit to their judgment. Margaret's fingers tightened for a second at my elbow and then released, and I noticed the familiar sight of my cross against my dress. The small gold that meant home felt like an anchor. We sat. The wood of the pew was smooth and warm from people's bodies. The hymn swelled again, tentative, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. Margaret leaned close, the scent of her lavender like a small consolation. "Your granddaughter called me," she whispered. "And Howard. He kept copies of things. He was worried, you know. He'd bring them home sometimes, bank statements, receipts. He couldn't make sense of it." Her words fell between us like a soft, decisive bell. I turned to look at her, at the pale hands with the prominent veins, and saw in her eyes not pity, not indifference, but something dangerous and necessary, recognition. From the pulpit, the pastor cleared his throat and scanned the room with those practiced eyes. He caught my gaze for a heartbeat, something unreadable flickering behind his smile. The sanctuary felt tilted, as if poised on the edge of a decision. I held my cross, felt its weight. Outside, through the stained glass, the sun lit the nave in warm shards. In that light, with my hand tucked against my chest and whispers like wind around me, I realized I had a choice to make. Stay in my seat, stand up, speak, or leave and let the silence take me again. Margaret squeezed my hand once, a small promise, and somewhere between the organ and the murmurs, I knew the next move would not be mine alone. I remember waking before my alarm, like my body knew the day would not be ordinary. My loves, thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking a few minutes to be here with me. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber feels like fresh air, helping us reach our first goal of 1,000. If this story moves you, please click subscribe, and if you can, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. It means everything. A few days before that Sunday, I woke before my alarm as if my body had made a promise I could no longer break. The kitchen light was thin and blue. The scent of last night's coffee still lingered in the pot, a burned, comforting memory that made me think of fellowship hour and paper cups and Henry's terrible donuts. I set the kettle on again out of habit and watched steam stitch the window. The morning felt ordinary in the smallest ways, and that was what scared me. I'm 67. Widow. Eleanor Moretti. For most of my adult life, this church has been the place my life folded into. Sunday school classes, quilting nights, the summer picnic where Howard would insist on cooking too much sausage. I taught the third-grade Bible class for years. I collected for the roof fund. People trusted me to bring the lemon bars and the attendance sheets. My life has footprints in every corner of that building. When Howard was alive, he kept things in order. He liked order. Receipts tucked into envelopes, notes pinned with careful little staples. He wrestled with the treasurer's ledgers after supper, the lamplight painting his hands amber. After he died, those habits became mine. I still keep the same corner of our filing cabinet for church papers, staples, bank slips, faded envelopes. It made sense then to ask questions when numbers stopped adding up. I never wanted a fight. I wanted answers. On Tuesday, Sophie called. Her voice was too young to sound like my anchor, but she tried. "Grandma, are you sure about this? It's a big step." She always calls me on small things and then talks about her day, her apartment in the city, the new internship, the way she can smell the coffee from the corner shop 2 blocks away. "I'm sure I'd rather be there than sitting at home wondering," I said, smoothing the navy dress on the chair. I had bought it because it felt right for a return, respectful but not hiding. Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Promise me you'll sit with someone," she said finally. "Don't go it alone, okay?" I told her I would. I told her I would go in the back. The line between pride and stubbornness is thinner than you think. That week the church bells started to sound like they always had. 3 slow calls at 6, 2 at noon, and a final clanging on Sunday morning. I would hear them through the open window, a sound that used to mean come together, and now sometimes felt like a summons. The pew where Howard and I used to sit had stayed empty for months after he died. The hymn book. Margaret called me twice that week. Her voice is a pebble, small but steady. Don't let them scare you, Eleanor, she said the first time. Howard used to bring home odd papers. He worried sometimes. I can't make sense of everything. But if you need a place to sit. That offer meant more than she knew. Margaret could have remained neutral. She could have averted her eyes. But the way she hesitated, then offered, told me what I already suspected. Not everyone had decided on a story to tell about me. On Friday I walked past the church at dusk. The stained glass window threw slashes of red and blue across the sidewalk. Inside, the altar light was on. I could see the brass offering plate gleam, and behind it, the crimson curtain that frames the pulpit like a theater stage. It looked small and theatrical from outside, like a place where announcements and prayers are made to sound truer than they sometimes are. The north aisle was empty. One pew had a hymn book with its spine broken. Someone had left a single coat draped over the back. No name, no note. A small, ordinary abandonment that felt like a warning. I slept poorly that night. The navy dress folded on a chair at the foot of my bed. I woke twice thinking of faces, people I'd baptized, people who had cried at my kitchen table. The house felt too quiet without Howard's paper shuffle. In the morning before I left, I stood in the doorway and watched the light move across the hardwood. A golden strip that could have been a path. I put my cross on. I picked up my bag with Howard's envelope still inside. I told myself aloud and small, "This is home. This is where you belong." My voice sounded older than usual, and for the first time in months, I felt the honest, trembling hope that maybe being seen again wouldn't hurt so badly. I didn't know then how sharp a single refusal could feel. I only knew that I was going back to the place that had shaped me, and that there were a few small signs, an empty pew, a broken hymnal, a red curtain, that suggested the congregation had already taken a side. I felt the cold of that incomplete gesture like a physical thing, my hand hanging in the air while Deacon James turned away. For a second the world narrowed to the heat of my palm and the sudden, useless emptiness where his fingers should have been. The organ swelled behind us and then softened into nothing. The hymn blurred. Someone coughed. Someone's heel scraped wood. My fingers tingled. My knees went soft the way they used to when Howard would surprise me with tulips in the kitchen. Only this time there was no surprise, only that hot open shame that spreads across your neck and stays. My bag bumped my hip, hard enough that my thumb found the seam and gripped it until it white-knuckled. The little cross at my throat felt heavier than it had that morning. He didn't have to shout. He didn't need to. "Mrs. Moretti, I don't think you should be here," he said, low and measured, the kind of voice that thinks its own civility makes cruelty cleaner. "Not after what you did to the pastor." The words landed and the room changed. Heads turned in a slow, precise rotation, like someone had pulled a string. Whispering started as a thread and then braided until it filled the sanctuary. Soft vowels and thin consonants, the way gossip always sounds like a tide. "She came back. After what she did." The syllables struck like small stones. People I had folded casseroles for. People who had sat with me through prayer chain lists. Faces I knew by laugh and by frown. Some looked away as if embarrassed to witness and expose. Some leaned in as if waiting for an act to begin. Betty Monroe's jaw tightened. Robert's mouth was a thin line. The Petersons exchanged a look that erased decades of shared potluck tables in a second. I tried to let my smile hold. I lifted my hand to that hollow handshake as if doing so could anchor me to what I had been. One of them, a familiar Sunday presence. His gaze slid over my fingers like they belonged to someone else. He reached past me with a deliberate, civilized motion and took the hand of the woman behind me. There was a silence that was not empty. It was full of things people don't say aloud. A rustle of hymn pages. Breath. The click of a heel. My own heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my teeth. My breath hitched. I remembered Sophie on the phone, telling me to sit with someone. I remembered Howard's methodical order in the records drawer, the receipts tucked into envelopes, the little notes in his careful hand. I remembered why I had asked questions in the first place. It wasn't malice. It was a stitch pulled loose that had to be examined. Someone murmured, "She ruined his reputation." Another voice, small and sure, "Always had a sharp tongue after the funeral." The judgments landed like fingers on a knitting, tightening and making the space smaller. Then Margaret's hand, warm and unexpected, came to my elbow. Her touch was a small, steadying thing in a room that suddenly felt as if it might tip. Margaret, with her glasses on a cord and the vein-led hands that had balanced the ledgers with Howard for years. She didn't flinch at the whispers. She didn't shrink. "Come sit with me, Eleanor," she said, not loud, but with a firmness like a hinge closing. We walked together down the aisle. The wood of the pews smelled faintly of lemon polish and old varnish. People watched as if watching a play. Some faces softened, some hardened. Margaret's fingers tightened for a moment around my elbow, and then let go. She guided me to the same pew where Howard and I had sat for years. The seat smelled faintly of Sunday coats and the warm press of bodies. I sat and felt my weight in that old ordinary place. She leaned close then, so close the lavender scent of her hair and the faint paper sour of old receipts came together. "Your granddaughter called me," she whispered. "Howard kept copies. He used to bring them home and worry. He couldn't make sense of it and he kept them in a box. I took them after he died." She handed me a thin envelope, careful as if it were a fragile thing. The paper made a soft sound in my hand. I felt, all at once, the ridiculousness of the moment, humiliated in front of the people I'd loved, and the clear, bright possibility the envelope represented. My fingers closed around the paper. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were bank statements, neat columns, notes in Howard's small slanting script, things that could make a clouded question sharp. For the first time since the deacon's refusal, something like clarity moved through me. From the pulpit, Pastor Ferguson's eyes found mine. There was that practiced smile, the one that sits easily on his face and seems to protect whatever lies beneath. He continued his greeting, voice smooth, but there was an undercurrent now, a tension unspoken. I thought of leaving. How easy it would be to walk out those doors and let the whisper settle into history. How effortless to fold myself back into solitude and grieve in silence. I looked down at my hand on the envelope. The leather of my bag bit into my hip. My breath was slow but steady. The cross warmed against my collarbone. If I left, the story would be theirs. If I stayed, nothing was promised except the work ahead. Questions to ask, documents to show, people to face. But staying was an act of acknowledgement, of refusing to be erased. Margaret's hand brushed mine briefly. No words, just pressure, and then she sat back, her posture a small shore. I pressed my thumb against the flap of the envelope as if testing a seam. The air in the sanctuary hummed, organ murmurs, the faint rustle of a page turned. I folded my fingers around the envelope and let the decision settle like a stone into the pond of my chest. I would not leave because they had chosen to make me small. I would not let the story end with a handshake in the air. I placed the envelope beside my purse, felt its presence like a new kind of prayer. My hand came back to the little gold cross, and I touched it once, twice. Then I sat up straighter than I had all morning and listened to the hymn as if the words mattered. I had come back to my church to be seen. I would not walk away unseen. The envelope sat in my lap like a small secret weight. The paper was thin and smelled faintly of old ink and attic dust. My thumb found the fold and I felt the tiny ridges of stapled receipts through the paper. For a moment I just listened, the organ humming beneath the murmurs, the scrape of hymnals, the low tide of breath all around me. Margaret leaned in. Her breath smelled of lavender and something floral from the church potluck. An ordinary scent that steadied me more than I expected. She lowered her voice to the kind of whisper that folds itself into pews and stays there. "Howard circled things," she said. Not everything, but things that didn't make sense. How long have you had these? I asked, my voice almost lost among the rustles. Since last summer, Margaret said. Howard brought them home and said he couldn't sleep. He said he didn't like where some of the numbers led. I thought he was worrying about nothing. I boxed them when he was gone. I wasn't sure what to do. Sophie called me and said, "Grandma, go." So I brought them. There was a pause. In that pause I watched Deacon James across the aisle. He held his hymnal with both hands, knuckles white. His jaw flexed twice. His button caught the light. He did not look at me. He looked at the pulpit and then at the choir loft and then quickly away. The practiced composure that had been his armor for years looked suddenly like a tight glove. Pastor Ferguson cleared his throat up on the platform. He smiled, the short, practiced smile people used to cover interruptions. His hand smoothed an invisible wrinkle in his sleeve. He didn't call my name. He didn't need to. The congregation felt the tension like a draft. "Mrs. Moretti." His voice came across like warm tea. "Perhaps we can discuss this privately. Accusations in public aren't." "Excuse me," I said. The words surprised me with how steady they were. My heart still thudded, but my voice didn't shake. "This is not an accusation. It's a question. If I stay silent, these questions die in the dark. If you ask me to leave, nothing changes." There was a stirring, soft but certain. Betty Monroe shifted in her seat. Someone coughed on the far side. The whispering grew, but it wasn't all the same kind of whisper now. Uncertainty had edged into a few faces. Deacon James rose, a small movement, the sort that makes people turn. He approached the aisle with slow, measured steps, as if he were taking a procession. His smile was thin. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice tried for concern but landed someplace colder. "It's not the time. We can set a meeting. The church has procedures." "Procedures," I repeated, the word tasting like old varnish. I looked at him, the neat suit, the wide ring, the line in his brow, and I thought of all the times we'd clasped hands and said amen. When the roof leaked, I counted envelopes. When the mission closed, I asked where the money went. Procedures shouldn't hide questions. Margaret's hand covered mine. Her touch was small and fierce. I could feel her pulse against my knuckles. Up on the platform, the pastor tilted his head, a practiced shepherd listening. His eyes met mine for a second. There was something like calculation there. Then he looked away, then back, and the practiced warmth returned like a mask settling into place. "You are asking for transparency," Margaret said, louder now by choice, not by accident. Her voice carried in a way her usual whisper never would. "Howard kept copies because he wanted to understand. We deserve to know." A ripple went through the room. Faces moved from curiosity to the shading of worry. Robert's mouth twitched. The Petersons exchanged glances that had more than gossip in them now. Concern, perhaps even dismay. A few heads nodded minutely, as if surfacing from sleep. Deacon James' fingers drummed once on the railing. "We will review this," he said, slow, official. "A committee. Properly. We don't need to make a spectacle." "Then call the committee now," I said. The words were soft, but they landed. "Call it this week. Bring the records, bring the ledgers. Let the people who volunteer here see the numbers. That's not spectacle. That's stewardship." For a second the sanctuary nearly held its breath. The pastor's hands folded over his Bible as if the leather might steady him. He cleared his throat and smiled with a different kind of warmth, one that smelled faintly of calculation. "We will address the concerns appropriately," he said. "Please, Mrs. Moretti, trust the process." I thought of Howard late at the kitchen table, glasses on the tip of his nose, pencil moving through columns. I thought of his small, careful notes. Why? And how he had kept faith with the ledgers as if they were a prayer. I pressed my thumb against the edges of the papers in my lap. "Trust the process. The words hovered and then dissolved. I squeezed Margaret's hand back. Her eyes were bright with a determination that steadied my own. "No more private meetings," I said. "If we're to restore faith, it must be in the light." Deacon James' mouth flattened. Pastor Ferguson's gaze slid to the choir, to the stained glass, to the back door. Somewhere behind me Sophie's voice seemed to echo, "Come sit with someone." I had sat with Margaret. Now the shape of the room felt different. The refusal of a handshake had been small and sharp and cruel. But the papers unfolded into something heavier. Outside, light slanted through the glass in thin bars. Inside, whispers were changing into questions. And for the first time that morning, I felt the heat of resolve bloom beneath my ribs. When the first Sunday settled into ordinary, the quiet after that handshake felt anything but. It was as if a seam had split along the pews and every small kindness I'd ever known slipped through. The organ finished its hymn and people moved like a tide that had learned a new rhythm. Away from me. At the coffee hour, the long table of styrofoam cups and paper plates sat like a small island. The smell of burnt coffee and cinnamon rolls, things that used to mean conversation, hung in the air and no one reached across the gap. Someone cleared their throat and politely the other side of the room shifted. Betty Monroe smiled as she poured, but she kept the paper cup between them both like a prop. Her eyes did not meet mine. On Tuesdays, the grocery store became a mirror of the sanctuary. Mrs. Langley, who used to stop and chat about casseroles and church bazaars, crossed the aisle at the produce section. The cashier who recognized me from years of Sunday donations scanned my items with a practiced neutrality that felt deliberate. I backed away with my bag of oranges and heard someone's laugh as if it had been meant for me. The town is small. News travels the way wind moves through dry grass. By Thursday my name had a shape to it. At the senior center, where I taught a once-a-month hymn history class, chairs were pulled in a little tighter when I walked in. People made excuses, appointments, errands. "We'll catch you next month." And the room I had always entered with a soft chorus of hello now offered only polite silence. I learned that the refusal of a single handshake could set into motion a dozen small doors closing. They were not dramatic slams. They were the quiet metallic click of locks turning one by one. It was hardest at the church itself. During the week I would pass the building to drop a casserole off or to mail a check. Doors that used to be propped by a volunteer were shut. The office lights were dim. On one Thursday afternoon I walked toward the fellowship hall and a man at the side door hurried inside, shutting it with a speed that made his shoulders rise. I stood there a moment, feeling the spring air on my face, and realized I was watching the door the way a child watches a favorite bird fly away. Even the children shifted. At Vacation Bible School sign-ups, a volunteer mother I had known for years made a point of standing between me and the registration table. Her smile was careful, arms folded, eyes on the clipboard. A child I used to tuck the sleeve of his jacket for looked at me and then quickly turned his head. I felt smaller in those moments than I had at any time since Howard died. Whispers patterned themselves into corners. They were not cruel so much as certain. "She caused trouble," someone would say, low enough to be respectable. "She shouldn't have made accusations." Another voice, softer. "But who else knew?" A question that drifted and landed differently depending on where it rested. In the pews on Sunday, couples who had once clasped hands with us at potlucks now exchanged looks that cut off conversations before they began. Invitations to the Wednesday prayer group ceased. A casserole I delivered for a sick member sat on a doorstep for an hour before someone drove by and picked it up. No one knocked to say thank you. The practical things were the cruelest. Checks that used to arrive through the mail stopped. Cards no longer appeared at my mailbox on my birthday. Sophie called less, not because she wanted to, but because the new distance took time to explain across a busy life. When she did call, her voice would tremble with worry. "Grandma, people are talking," she would say. "I'm sorry." I hated that it had become her burden. There were moments of absurdity, like the woman from the choir, who would now only nod at me from across the aisle and make a point of conversing loudly about the pastor's leader. Still others closed ranks. Deacon James took up a posture of officious reserve that seemed intended to keep me at a distance. He greeted the congregation with his usual firmness and left his hands in his pockets when I passed. Pastor Ferguson's smiles grew more rehearsed, his thank you notes more formal. Meetings were suggested, committees, procedures, a time for review. All language that placed a wall between complaint and consequence. The envelope Margaret had given me sat heavy in my bag like a small waiting thing. Some Sundays I would rest my hand over it and feel the papers through the paper, the faint rustle that promised more. It felt like a heart beating under my coat, quiet, persistent. The isolation around me sharpened the sound. Where before I might have shrunk into silence, now the hush pushed me toward a different edge. I could feel the congregation drawing a circle, and with each careful step they took away from me, the line of that circle became clearer. People asked themselves which story to tell. Some chose the tidy narrative handed down by the pulpit, the one that preserved peace. Others hesitated, their mouths shaping questions they did not yet dare voice out loud. The longer I stayed in the room, the more I realized that isolation was not only an absence of touch. It was also the heavy, patient work of rearranging how a town remembered you. Each day the whispers changed shape and yet said nearly the same thing. I watched them pass from pew to pew like folded notes, and I learned to listen for the pauses, the tiny breaths between words that revealed who was simply repeating and who was starting to wonder. The circle around me tightened. The envelope in my bag did not. He's in the pulpit now, and his voice rolls through the sanctuary like a practiced tide. Smooth, measured, the kind of sermon voice that's been polished over years. It fills the rafters and comes back to me as an echo, folding over the hymnals and the heads bowed in the pews. Sounds like Sunday. Sounds like command. I sit very still. My fingers are laced together so tightly my knuckles are white. I can feel the seam of my purse digging into my hip, the envelope warm against my leg. My breath is a careful thing. Short, contained, as if any deeper inhale might tip something in me over. The pulpit smells of old varnish and lemon polish, wood that remembers hands and hymns and offerings. The smell roots me and makes the room seem older and smaller all at once. Pastor Ferguson's cadence hits a familiar cadence, lift, pause, bless, and for a second I almost let the words wash me. Then he names stewardship and his tone shifts. A thin brightness threading through his sentences now. He is speaking of trust, of unity. His eyes sweep the room and land on me like a stage light that doesn't quite warm. Deacon James is beside the aisle, hands folded, the gold band on his finger catching light. He smiles with a civility that is practiced into armor. He does not meet my gaze. The choir is quiet behind him. The organ has softened to a single impatient note. My hands refuse to stop clasping each other. I press my thumb into the envelope's edge and feel the ridge of Howard's neat handwriting. Margaret sits 2 pews down, her posture a little too straight, her mouth set like someone holding back a song. I can hear her breath as a soft metronome. Then Pastor Ferguson tells a story about sacrifice, about giving without expecting return, and the words land like pennies in an offering plate. He looks up, and for a moment his smile becomes a question. I find my mouth moving before my fear catches up. I stand. It happens like a small indignation, nothing theatrical. The wood under my feet is warm. I feel the smoothness of the pew back under my palm as I rise. A cough flutters through the room. Someone shifts a hymnal. The echo of my shoes is louder than it should be. Please, I say, and my voice is steadier than I feel. If we're talking about stewardship, if we're talking about trust, then the people should see the books. Now, the sanctuary tilts. You would think those words ordinary. They're not. They press into the hush like a key into a lock. Heads turn. The echo of my request bounces off stained glass and choir stalls. Pastor Ferguson's practice warmth thins into something sharper. Deacon James' jaw tightens. He moves forward a step, measured as if conducting a ritual. "Mrs. Moretti," he says, voice low, the kind that aims to contain. "This isn't the time for." "Then when is it?" My hands unclench for a moment and I almost feel dizzy. The envelope is suddenly too heavy to ignore. "Call the committee this week. Bring the ledgers. Let the congregation see." A ripple like a faint wind runs through the room. Margaret exhales, soft like a stitch coming undone, and the air seems to hold. Someone drops a hymn book. The sound is sharp and ridiculous and loud. It echoes. Pastor Ferguson smiles that careful smile and tries to steer us back. "We have procedures," he says. "We can address this privately." Private meetings hide questions. Margaret's voice is small, but what it lacks in volume it makes up for in steadiness. She leans forward, and when she does her glove brushes mine across the pew. Her fingers squeeze mine, a private anchor. For a breath there is only the organ's low hum, like the bass line of something about to happen. Then the candle on the altar gutters. A soft flare, and the tiny yellow flame shudders and goes out, leaving a wisp of smoke that smells of wax and old prayers. People murmur. The echo of the pastor's next sentence thins mid-phrase and sounds oddly raw. As if in answer, the side door, a church door I've watched swing open and closed my whole life, creaks slowly. It is a simple sound, a small domestic complaint, but in this moment it cracks the room like a seam. Heads swivel to the back. Light falls differently for a second, slanting along the pews in a way that makes everyone's faces look more honest. Then, God help me. The small metal crucifix that hangs near the pulpit gives a soft groan and comes loose. It swings once and slips free with a quiet clatter onto the wooden floor. The sound it makes is not dramatic. It is a small, ordinary fall. Yet it lands right in the middle of the waiting air like a punctuation mark. People gasp, not from fear but from surprise. The choir chair tips a fraction. Deacon James' hand twitches. Pastor Ferguson's face changes. Microseconds of something other than practiced calm show there. An eye narrowing, the jaw mapping a decision. The sanctuary, full of decades of quiet rituals, feels suddenly like the inside of a clock with one cog out of place. The whispering starts, at first a low thread, then louder. Some look embarrassed for me. Some look offended. Some look intrigued. The room smells of wax, lemon, and the musk of many bodies in a small space. I feel my knees steady. My breath is still measured. The envelope rests on my lap like a small fierce thing. I can feel the thrum of people in the wood under me. Margaret's hand finds mine again. Under the hymn book it is warm and sure. "Let it be open," I say. "Not for scandal. For truth." Pastor Ferguson's mouth moves. For a moment he offers the old line, process, privacy, respect. Then Deacon James clears his throat, and you can see the arithmetic in his face, the counting of what is lost and what is saved. He looks at the fallen crucifix, at the dark patch where the candle once burned, and I think I see the scaffolding of his certainty wobble. The moment holds, taut as a string. Outside, the oak leaves scrape against the parking lot like fingers. Inside, for the first time that morning, I feel a small shift, an almost inaudible change in the way people are facing the sun through the stained glass. The refusal of a handshake has already happened. This is what comes after. The choice to hide or to open the curtains. I fold my hands again, not to hide anything but to steady myself. The envelope tempts me, heavy with the years Howard kept in neat piles. The sanctuary breathes around me. The candle smoke curls toward the rafters like a question. The crucifix lies where it landed, wooden and ordinary. Not ruined but set differently. There is noise now, voices that are no longer only whispering but asking. The sermon has become something else entirely. The echo of the pastor's voice continues, but it's braided now with the clearer sound of people waking up. I can feel the first ripple of a new current under the old rituals, and it makes my chest ache with something like hope. The weeks that followed felt like a slow turning of gears I hadn't known were attached to my life. Once Margaret handed me that envelope. Once I pressed my thumb to Howard's neat notes and felt the rasp of staples beneath the pages shifted. Numbers lined up and then didn't. There were withdrawals with no corresponding receipts. There were checks written to names that did not appear on any committee ledger. Memos said things like roof repair and pastor car repair. Phrases Howard had underlined and written a single urgent "why" beside. Those question marks were like breadcrumbs. The CPA followed them. It was not a single smoking gun. It was the steady accumulation of small inconsistencies that pointed the same direction. Deposits that were smaller than the fundraisers warranted. Transfers labeled miscellaneous for months in a row. Receipts that were misfiled, others that could not be matched to any bank entry. When the accountant laid the statements out on the table, the red lines formed their own sentence. By the time the committee reported back to the congregation, the sanctuary smelled like coffee and lemon and the hush that comes before a town learns something it has suspected. The committee read its findings aloud. Discrepancies significant enough to warrant further action, the CPA said. The phrase echoed. Pastor Ferguson, who had been so practiced at making his stewardship sound like moral instruction, stood and said he would step away temporarily while the church sorted the books. He called it a leave of absence. I called it a consequence. People reacted in the ways people in small places always react. There were faces that went vacant with shame. There were others that sharpened into vindication. Some who had whispered felt suddenly embarrassed to remember how loudly they had joined in. A few came and touched my arm with a small, awkward apology. "Eleanor," Betty said once during a coffee hour that felt like a trial. "I'm sorry. We should have listened." Her eyes were wet and raw. I accepted her hand. I didn't need theatrical humility. I needed honesty. Deacon James, however, became a study in avoidance. He did not raise his eyes when he passed me in the aisle. He kept his hands tucked into his coat pockets, the gold band on his finger catching light like a small accusation. He arranged committees and meetings with the cool efficiency of someone trying to recover control. But the small social rituals that make a church feel like a family, pressing palms at the passing of the peace, a nod and a hello in the fellowship hall, those thinned around him when it came to me. He had refused a handshake in public once. He would not do it again, and that refusal settled into the way he moved through the room. I won't pretend the vindication felt like triumph. The relief was cleaner than I expected, but it carried its own grief. We found the truth in numbers and notes. That truth peeled back an image of pastoral infallibility and exposed human error, at best, or deliberate misdirection, at worst. The people I had favored for decades had been the same people who could, in a sentence, rearrange memories to protect an institution. The church I loved had been a safe place and a place of secrecy at once. Still, there was a dignity in the process. Margaret's quiet bravery, bringing a shoebox of Howard's worry to the light, had unrolled into something larger than gossip. Sophie, who had told me to sit with someone and then sat with me herself, made calls and coaxed younger members into the committee. The town watched as the accounts were opened and the numbers told a story we could no longer deny. When Pastor Ferguson stepped down, his resignation read like a cautious attempt at containment. He emphasized his love for the congregation and asked for prayer. Some people left the church that day, hurt and angry and unsure what faith meant when leadership falters. Others stayed. I stayed. A few Sundays after the report, I moved from the back pew where I had braced myself for humiliation into the middle row, the one Howard and I had once favored. The wood felt familiar beneath my palm. The hymn book was worn where his thumb had marked songs. When the congregation rose to exchange the sign of peace, hands reached across aisles toward me. Some were tentative. Some were firm. Deacon James' eyes did not lift. He passed by and kept looking straight ahead. It hurt in the same small place it had the day he refused me. But so did the other things. Margaret squeezed my hand beneath a hymnal. Betty's voice trembled when she said, Eleanor, we should have listened sooner. Sophie stood behind me, proud and steady like a single small flag. The relief was not vindictive. It did not look like triumph. It felt like the settling of a stone at the bottom of a pond, the circle of ripples slowly calming. I had asked for the books to be open because silence had become a sanctuary for the wrong things. We had asked questions because Howard would have asked them at the kitchen table with a pencil and a lamp. The questions did not ruin our faith. They forced us to reckon with what faith looks like when the people who lead are also fallible. On my way out one afternoon, a woman I had taught to sing as a child took my hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said, and it was small and private and true. I could hold that. I could live with the fact that not everyone would meet my eyes. The cost of truth is not always universal reconciliation. Sometimes it is simply being seen again and choosing to stay. When I think back to the morning my hand hung in the air, I still feel the chill of that pause. But now, when I extend my hand during the passing of the peace, most people grasp it. The memory of that single public refusal sits beside a new memory. The congregation learning, painfully and slowly, what stewardship means. Deacon James no longer looks my way. He has not made amends the way some might wish. But the church, the people, are learning the shape of honesty. Faith for me has become less a blanket and more a mission. A willingness to stand in light, even when the light shows the shadows. I kept my place. I kept my dignity. And the papers Howard kept, with Margaret's courage and Sophie's voice, made the silence impossible to maintain. Truth arrived in a pile of simple statements. It did not save every relationship. It did, though, restore a kind of basic steady justice. And that was enough. The pew where Howard and I used to sit still remembers the shape of us. I can feel the worn dip in the wood with my palm when I pass it. Sunday light cuts through the stained glass in the same way it always has. Thin bands of red and blue that land on hymnals and shoulders. It makes everything look older and softer, as if time here moves the way the organ moves. Measured, steady, forgiving. People still come. The coffee is still burnt sometimes, and the fellowship table still leans under paper plates and styrofoam cups. There are new faces, 2 young couples with babies, a man who sings too loudly and smiles like he means it. Those small ordinary things are a kind of mercy. They stitch the sanctuary back together. But there are absences I can map by where the light falls. Deacon James walks a different perimeter now, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat like a man keeping his balance. He nods to others, exchanges the practiced civility of his office, but he never meets my eyes. Sometimes I think that refusal of a handshake made a small path through his life that he cannot cross again. It hurts. It also shows me how thin the lines were between belonging and performance. The envelope that Howard kept, Howard who marked little question marks like prayers, sits now in a folder on my kitchen shelf. It is a quiet thing, a soft packet of balance sheets and notes that once felt like a bomb in my palm. I open it sometimes, not to relive the scandal, but to feel the texture of proof under my fingers, the staples Howard's slanted handwriting, the margins he circled and left with that single word. Why? Those papers did not shout. They simply asked. And when a question is asked in a room long used to silence, something in that room has to answer. Margaret still comes. Her hat is a little softer at the brim. Her hands are a little more knotted with age. She squeezes my hand beneath a hymn book the way she always has, as if passing a prayer. Sophie sits behind me on Sundays more than she needs to. She leans against the pew and watches faces like a small sentinel. She brings me home-cooked soup and reminders to rest. Her presence is steady, a bright practical thing. There are afternoons when I still hear her voice in my head telling me to sit with someone. She was right. The town murmurs on. The committee did what committees do. Papers were opened, numbers lined up, apologies said in small tones. Pastor Ferguson stepped away. People rearranged their loyalties quietly, the way curtains are shifted when sunlight becomes too honest. Some left. Some stayed. I stayed. Now when I reach for the sign of peace in the service, hands meet mine more often than they used to. Some fingers are tentative, testing the warmth. There was an empty pew at the back when we passed, a ribbon of cushion unpressed, a hymn book closed and waiting. For a moment I stopped and looked at it. The afternoon sun sliced across its slats and painted a small, ordinary cross of light. I thought of how often I'd imagined that same pew full of faces, of casseroles and birthday cards and the simple traffic of fellowship. Now it sat quiet, not lost, simply reshaped by what had been learned. Margaret's hand found mine in the pause. Her fingers were warm and alive. "We did the right thing," she said. Not proudly but with the exhausted certainty of someone who has kept watch over a house of papers for too long. I squeezed back. Her words didn't erase the hurt. They simply balanced it with something else: work done, truth given a place to live. We stepped outside together. The air smelled like early spring, cut grass and the thin, clean tang of rain on pavement. Sophie was waiting by the car with the engine idling, her scarf tucked tight at her neck. I could hear her footsteps recede as she walked around to my side, the soft, sure beat of someone who knows when to shelter and when to let go. When I closed the heavy wooden door behind us, the wind caught it and it swung shut with a definite, final sound. It wasn't a slam. It was the close of something honest, the sound a book makes when you set it down after reading the last page. The steps on the sidewalk faded away, then the hum of traffic took over, then the silence of my own breath. On my way home I held the folder on my lap like a small warmth. It is not vengeance I feel. It is the calm that follows truth. A steadying, a settling. Some things in the church have been mended. Others are still raw, like a seam that needs time and careful hands to heal. Faith for me is less about being untroubled and more about being steady in the face of trouble. It is choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It is turning toward light even when it shows the stains. The empty pew remains, a place that could be filled. The door closes and the wind moves on. My hand brushes the little gold cross at my throat, and I feel the weight and the warmth of it. I take a breath. I step forward. The sound of my shoes on the pavement is ordinary and true. The weeks after the committee's report felt like learning to walk on a shore I had long thought steady. The pews still creaked the way they always have. The coffee still burns sometimes. Lemon polish still smells like church mornings. But those ordinary things carry a different weight now. Quieter, not because the room is empty, but because it has been rearranged by truth. I sit in the middle row more often these days. It is the same wood Howard and I used to press our palms into, but my hands find a new hardness when they rest there. People pass me the sign of peace with hands that test the warmth before they let it in. Some fingers are tentative, still learning, and some are firm, as if reclaiming something they forgot how to hold. Margaret squeezes my hand beneath the hymn book like a semaphore. Sophie stands behind me, arms folded, face soft with relief and something like pride. Her presence is steady as a porch light on a dark road. Not everyone returned. Some chairs remain empty, smaller absences like the hollow part of a sweater. Deacon James keeps his distance. He is a careful man whose civility turned into a kind of armor the day he refused my hand. When our paths cross now, his eyes slide past me and his smile tightens. It still stings, sometimes in the old place behind my ribs. But the sting has a border now. It stops where evidence begins. There were apologies, too awkward, real, sometimes clumsy. Betty's voice cracked when she said, "I'm sorry," in the fellowship hall, holding a paper cup like a peace offering. A few neighbors who had cooled toward me reached tentative hands across the coffee table once the facts were in the open. Not everyone who turned away came back. Some needed more time. Some simply chose a clean break. That is their right. I am not the arbiter of who can grieve for what we lost. The envelope sits in a folder on my kitchen shelf. I open it sometimes, fingers tracing Howard's penciled question marks, the neat circles he used to make with that habit of his, like prayers folded into ink. The paper smells faintly of attic dust and the candle wax from the church. It does not feel like a weapon anymore. It feels like proof that being careful is not the same as being distrustful. It is the slow work of stewardship. We found not one grand theft but a pattern, lines that did not line up, mementos that should have companions but did not. When the CPA laid out the statements, the red pen became a kind of language. The pastor stepped away. People murmured. Some left and hurt. Some stayed to stitch the seams. The church learned, unwillingly at first, that the word stewardship has teeth. Holding that evidence, holding nothing more than the quiet persistence of numbers, changed things. It didn't make everything new overnight. It did make some people honest with themselves in ways they had not been. It made committees stop hiding behind phrases like procedures and start answering real questions. It made a formerly private ledger open into a public conversation about what it means to care for each other. Faith for me looks smaller and truer after all that. I used to think faith was a blanket, warm and unquestioning. Now faith feels more like a pair of hands. They shake sometimes, they mend when necessary, and they refuse to let light be locked away. I stay because I want to witness that work. I stay because Howard would have kept asking why, with his pencil and his lamp, until someone answered. There were Sundays when I felt the whole town watching, weighing my place like a scale. There were other Sundays when people who had been silent began to ask questions of their own. Curiosity is a humble thing. It is not drama. It is the first step toward reckoning. In those small gestures, someone asking to see the minutes, a young couple staying after to help file papers, I found a kind of redemption. Not for everyone, but for enough. Margaret is a quiet hero in this. She moves with the same careful grace, a little slower now, hat brim lower, eyes that miss nothing. She opened her box and let me hold what Howard had worried over for years. Sophie kept calling, kept nudging committees, kept showing up. When I walk home from church, the air smells of cut grass and distant rain. I carry the folder like a talisman, and sometimes I think of how often ordinary vigilance is mistaken for troublemaking. It is not. It is care. People ask me if I'm glad I went back that Sunday. Glad is not quite the word. There is relief, yes. There is also loss, the knowledge that belonging can be conditional, that institutions are made of fallible people. But there is also a steadiness I didn't know I wanted. The steadying that comes when questions are asked aloud and answered, even if the answers are messy. I still feel the echo of that handshake in the air, the cold missing warmth. But that echo taught me how to listen for who was with me even when the room tried to make me small. It taught me to trust the small cards of courage people hand each other in hidden ways. Truth arrived not as a trumpet but as a stack of papers and the quiet bravery of two women, one who kept the numbers, another who kept the courage to bring them forward. When I look at the little gold cross Howard gave me, I do not find certainty. I find a map. I find a reminder that faith sometimes asks you to stay, and that courage often looks like ordinary persistence. The church will continue to hold its memories, some tarnished, some bright. I will continue to come and to witness. I will continue to keep my hand ready for those who reach honestly. There are losses I cannot fix, and there are small mercies that mend in time. In the end, what mattered most was not being right but being seen, and finally being allowed to keep the light on the ledger where everyone could read it. Some truths are quiet until you open the drawer. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.